about time to get started. Welcome, everyone. Some of you I know, others I don't. I'm Sarah Geis, and I'm the Associate Director of the Lewis Center. So I was not here the first 2 weeks, but I'm here now, and I'm especially really excited because Abby here, who's going to be your teacher, is my mentee for the next couple semesters. So that'll be really exciting. You're going to really enjoy Abby. Abby Oakley is a MA Apologetics student, and your other master's degree, you had one before this. What was it in?
Public Administration.
Public Administration. Okay. So Abby has been in school for a while, and so she knows how to research, knows how to compile good information, and I think that you'll benefit greatly from her. So Abby, go ahead and get started.
All right, thanks Sarah. Good introduction. So today we are going to be discussing chapter 5, which is the fine-tuning of the universe, an abductive argument for a designer. If you don't know what that means, stay put. I will explain. I'd first like to start with a caveat. I am not a scientist nor a physicist. I wish I knew the intricacies of string theory and M theory. Unfortunately, I do not and probably never will. So, I've compiled all this information and appealed to a vast array of expertise in this field. So you're going to hear from some great scientists who know what they're talking about and have all done great research to compile information and make this a viable argument. So as you can see, I've listed 3 quotes in the very beginning, and I'd like to read them because I think they're really important. The first is by Aristotle in his book On Philosophy. He says, "When thus they would suddenly gain sight of the earth, seas, and the skies, when they should come to know the grandeur of the clouds and the might of the winds, when they should behold the sun and should learn its grandeur and beauty, as well as its power to cause the day by shedding light over the sky, and again, when the night had darkened the lands, and they should behold the whole of the sky spangled and adorned with stars. And when they should see the changing lights of the moon as it waxes and wanes, and the rising and settings of all the celestial bodies, their course is fixed and changeless through all eternity. When they should behold all these things, most certainly they would have judged both that there exist gods and that all these marvelous works are the handiworks of the gods." It's Aristotle. Romans 1:20, some of you may be really familiar with that verse. "Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made." Last but not least, Michael Behe, a Christian biochemist and intelligent design advocate. He says, "Science is not a game in which arbitrary rules are used to decide what explanations are to be permitted. Rather, it is an effort to make true statements about physical reality." So, why did I include these quotes? Obviously, they don't appeal directly to a Christian God per se, especially the first one. Obviously, Aristotle lived in pre-Christian times, but he was saying by the evidence of the beauty and the majesty of the skies, the seas, and the lands, that obviously something created this. So it points to an intelligent design. Romans 1:20 also appeals to the things perceived in nature that have been made. Again, there's not a direct reference to the Christian God, but to rather his creation and what has resulted from this intelligent design. Lastly, I think Michael Behe's quote is really important because in our world today, evolution is pretty much the only viable, accepted type of science. And so when he says explanations are to be permitted, that's pretty much all that is permitted, we would say nowadays. However, I want to appeal to the objective argument of fine-tuning as an effort to make true statements about physical reality, because I think we can find some of those true statements. And before I go a little further, I just wanted to review from the previous chapter, chapter 4. You learned about why the universe exists. William Lane Craig has a great quote at the end that I think summarizes the whole chapter. "On the basis, therefore, of both philosophical and scientific evidence, we have good grounds for believing that the universe began to exist, Since whatever begins to exist has a cause, it follows that the universe has a transcendent cause, which is a great place to pick up right now and delve into fine-tuning, which is what I'm about to. Anyone have any questions first before I go on? Everyone good? Okay. So fine-tuning. I want to define some terms first. That's most important. This can be a little bit dense. So the design argument, which is what fine-tuning comes out of, is the principles of divine inference, which postulates that the universe is the handiwork of a designing agent. Obviously, we appealed to that in the quotes that were previously mentioned. And an abductive argument, which I mentioned in my title. So it's an argument which appeals to the best possible explanation. So our task here is going to discover the simplest and best explanation for what we perceive. So it's going to be an amalgamation of just different evidences, and it's going to all accumulate and appeal to the best argument. On the next page, I have outlined fine-tuning. Fine-tuning is defined as the range of life-permitting values for the constants and quantities which are extremely narrow. So I thought this was a beautiful quote which summarized it. It's by Sir Roger Penrose. He says, "How big was the original phase volume that the Creator had to aim for in order to provide a universe compatible with the second law of thermodynamics and with what we now observe? The Creator's aim must have been precise to an accuracy of 1 part in 10 to the 10th to the 23rd. This is an extraordinary figure. One could not possibly write the number down in full in the ordinary denary notation. It would be followed by 10 to the 123rd successive zeros. That's astronomical. Even if we were to write 0 on each separate proton, on each separate neutron in the entire universe, and we could throw in all the other particles as well for good measure, we should fall far short of writing down the figure needed. This is the precision needed to set the universe on its course." As I said previously, I'm not a scientist or a physicist, but 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power is a really big number. So, another way to think of fine-tuning is, any musicians in here? Any musicians? Okay. Well, you know that when they have the guitar or a piano, some kind of instrumentation, it has to be so precisely tuned to have them produce the most melodic sounds, and that's what I kind of think of when I think of fine-tuning originally. So, kind of going on from this, there's 2 kinds of fine-tuning, which Craig mentioned in his book. There are the constants of nature. This is described as the law of nature expresses mathematical equations with unchanging quantities, such as the force of gravity, electromagnetic force, etc. And this is important. The laws of nature do not determine the value of these constants. So, for instance, with gravity existing as a law of nature in general, you can have 4/10 of gravity, 5/10 of gravity, 6/10 of gravity, something along those lines, and it's not determining what these constants are. And there's also arbitrary physical qualities. These are just put in as initial conditions on which the laws of nature operate, and also not determined by laws of nature. It's just a given. There was a certain amount of oxygen, hydrogen, etc. at the Big Bang, and that's where it all began from. So these were just put in. We don't know why, except for fine-tuning. So, finally, getting to fine-tuning, we have the hypotheses. And I have to say thank you to Dr. Groteis for such a succinct argument in his book. There are 3 choices you could choose from to explain fine-tuning. You can say it's physical necessity of the numbers. You can say it's all by chance. Last but not least, you can say it's by design or an intelligent designer. So it goes as follows. X is either designed or the result of chance or the result of natural law or necessity. It's also the combination of change and natural law. X is not the result of chance or natural law or the combination of both. Therefore, X is the result of design. And so that's what I'm going to try to prove within this. Any questions so far? Anyone? So the first alternative to design, the first postulate is physical necessity, or everything is just so. Yes, the universe is, this is what proponents would say probably. Yes, the universe is fine-tuned, but with the specific constants and values of the mathematical equations, there was really no chance or little chance of the universe's not being life permitting. So the anthropic constants are crucial here. The universe hinges on these. These numbers had to exist in order for it to be considered fine-tuned. So here, I've quoted a couple of people who can say this much more eloquently than I can. For example, the original phase space volume requires fine-tuning to an accuracy of 1 part in 10 million multiplied by itself 123 times. Yet again, very big number. Martin Rees, he's an astronomer and committed naturalist, will even concede that physical necessity has to exist. He says the mathematics for human life boils down to 6 numbers. These 6 numbers consist of the properties of gravity, density, force, atoms, the expanding universe, and 3 spatial dimensions. So, if any of these numbers were altered even to the tiniest bit of the degree, there would be no stars, no complex elements, and no life. Stephen Hawking, we all know who he is. He says, it seems that there are relatively few ranges of values for the numbers of the constants that would allow for development of any form of intelligent life. Most sets of values would give rise to universes that, although they might be very beautiful, would contain no one able to wonder at that beauty. So obviously, we have to exist in order to see that beauty, and he's just saying that they would be so far off that no one would exist. Stephen Baer, a famous physicist, if the strength of the strong nuclear force were even slightly weaker or stronger than it is, it would have been disastrous for the possibility of life. Last but not least, William Lane Craig. If the primordial matter and antimatter had been differently proportioned, if the universe had expanded just a little more slowly, if the entropy of the universe were marginally greater, any of these adjustments and more would have prevented a life-permitting universe. Yet all seem perfectly possible physically. So, looking at physical necessity, it seems pretty legitimate. Everything is just so to obtain life, and we can't really question that. However, there are some objections. One of the first objections, the constants in the universe must with certainty possess the values they hold. So these values just had to have exist. The person who maintains that the universe must be life-permitting is taking a radical line which requires strong proof. But there is none. This alternative of physical necessity is simply put forward as a bare possibility. William Lane Craig says this in his other book, Reasonable Faith. So, in order to get out of this conundrum, some proponents will point to the theory of everything. They say, the theory of everything, hey, everything, we're going to eventually discover this, and it's going to have contained in it all of the physical necessities and constants, and it's just going to solve everything, right? It's very helpful to solving the problems of physics. It'd be great if we found this number. It would reveal the connections to the physical constants of why, but cannot explain why particular numbers exist. So they give them to us, but we would say, well, why 4 and not 6? Why 5 and not 3? So it really wouldn't get behind the idea of why it had to be the way it is. So the burden of proof is on the person to claim that a life-prohibiting universe is physically impossible. And that's a pretty strong burden to bear. So therefore, physical necessity fails for its strong dependence on certain factors, values, equations to argue for a life-permitting universe. So we can strike that out, yes.
Do you think you could give, since you've been using the idea of constants, could you give a real brief definition of what constants mean then in this context?
Sure, definitely. So constant is just going to be a mathematical equation, like for instance, the force of gravity is going to be A plus B plus C equals, etc., 4 or whatever. So, yeah, it's going to be a specific mathematical number, and it has to stay constant throughout. It's never going to shift.
Why is that important then?
Okay. It's very important because it just shows the absolute need to have that number. And so if it were to be able to switch and change, then this argument would obviously fall apart. So, any more
Oakley would
questions?
cease to exist, so it wouldn't
Exactly.
matter.
We would cease to exist and it would not matter. Any more questions? Good? Okay, so physical necessity has been shot down. There's a second alternative to design, which is chance, saying we lucked out. This is one a lot of people in modern day like to appeal to. We're just here, just because. Not quite. So, chance is an undirected, random effect of the Big Bang. However, there is statistical absurdity in stating that there is only one life-permitting universe, ours, out of the effects of random chance. So, in order to get out of this, many scientists must appeal to a mini-universe or a multiverse theory. Has anyone heard of this before? Okay, besides the book. Okay. So this just says that our current universe is one of countless, possibly infinite, life-permitting universes. If you throw the cosmic dice many times, an extremely improbable universe will eventually come up. So, I guess a good illustration too is lottery. Someone's number's got to come. An alternative to this alternative is the multi-domain universe, where the universe is connected to a deep and unknown level where each domain is isolated from the rest. And so, that leads, obviously, so we just say that, hey, there's a random chance that there's just tons of universes out there and we're one of many. Well, what are some objections? Because that can sound pretty probable. The multiverse is bizarrely speculative and fails to answer any real questions. In here, Lee Strobel refers to it as a multiverse escape hatch. There's no explanation for the apparatus responsible for the manufacturing of these universes, so it doesn't even get back to the original universe of why. And so William Lane Craig says he has the anthropic principle on page 116 through 117. And I think he did a really good illustration with the shooting. And let's see. Imagine you're traveling abroad and arrested on trumped-up drug charges. You're dragged in front of a firing squad of 100 trained marksmen standing at a point-blank range. You hear the command, ready, aim, fire. You hear the deafening sound of the guns, and then you realize you're alive. They all missed. Now what would you include? Well, you shouldn't be surprised they all missed. After all, if they hadn't missed, they wouldn't be here surprised about it. And so I think he just illustrates that the whole thing was set up and engineered for some reason. And so that is obviously one negative. There's a multi-domain theory as well. And this can be a little more plausible because we're appealing not to many universes but to ones that are on different domain levels. But it's what's commonly referred to as a post-dated check theory. So it's built on possibilities we may know in the future, but we obviously don't right now. They're both speculative and depend on the future. So that defeats both of those. Any questions for that one?
Could you clarify the multi-domain universe a little bit, what it means by connected to a deep and unknown level where each domain is isolated?
Sure. So let me go back. Universe, deep and unknown level. So it's just where each one is going to be, each domain is isolated from the rest. So it's just a universe that's on like different levels, and so like there's like a life universe here, a life universe there, a life universe there. So it's just living within different domains.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, obviously, that's going to be shot down as well. And last but not least, I would like to talk about design. So design is simply the purposeful arrangement of parts. Pretty easy. The design hypothesis then contains 3 different factors within them. It's contingency, complexity, and specificity. That's the hardest word to say. And there's a caveat. So each factor by itself is a necessary but insufficient condition of design, meaning they can't necessarily stand alone. One of the best illustrations of this is, say you are an archaeologist and you find these beautiful, wonderful statues, and they are just exquisitely done. So you can look at these and you can say, hey, like, this is wonderful, this is beautiful, and it hints at a creator, but it doesn't tell you for sure, obviously. Who knows where the artist is? So you definitely want to have each of these 3 things cumulatively to create a case for design. The first one is contingency. It's an event or object is contingent if it's not explicable on the basis of natural law. That is, it cannot be explained by automatic processes. So I tried it, then William Dembski, he's also another famous Christian scientist who's Christian, excuse me. And so he talks about this. Artistic masterpieces. So, we naturally do this in life. We can go to the Louvre, we can go to a beautiful museum, and we say, oh, look at this. This is a work of art. This is beautiful. This is great. We know that someone didn't naturally create that. Someone put the paint on that canvas. Someone hung it up, someone framed it and made it beautiful. So it's contingent on a creator. Someone designed that, and it's not found in the natural world. Complexity is the second one. The more elaborate an object or entity, the more likely it is not a result of chance. Chemical compounds is a wonderful example. Some of these do naturally obviously exist, but the more complex they are, obviously something had to design and create it. For instance, the human enzyme or the DNA of a person. Those are what we would call irreducibly complex. And last but not least is specificity or specification. It's an object or an event where it exhibits a pattern independent of its mere probability. So there are improbable or contingent factors that must be specified ahead of time and not afterwards. For example, if I'm doing a magic trick and I tell you what I aim to do, I'm going to make someone disappear. I have to specify that ahead of time instead of after the fact someone disappears and I try to make it up. Obviously I'm going to be lying if they're still there. Another one is a bull's mark. I say that I'm going to shoot and I'm going to hit dead center of the target. I can't go back and say, hey, I'm going to try to aim for this, and it ends up not making the mark. It has to be defined ahead of time. Any questions about that? I know that's complex. So I would like to move on to something else, which is Richard Dawkins. He's the anti-design argument. So has anyone in here read The God's Illusion, heard of God's Illusion? It was in 2006. It was his best-selling book. And he really created a firestorm with this. And actually his central thesis is the following argument in the book. And he says this proves God does not exist. He first says, one of the greatest challenges to human intellect has been to explain how the complex and probable appearance of design in the universe arises. So obviously Christians and atheists alike are going to try to be answering these questions. Number 2, the natural temptation is to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. Just as a man-made watch is a product of an intelligent designer, there exists an imminent impulse to apply the same logic to an eye or a wing, a spider, or a person. So obviously he's appealing to the whole contingency factor in design. Number 3, the temptation is a false one. because the design hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. Number 4, Darwinian evolution provides the most powerful explanation, accounting for the statistical improbability in natural selection. 5, unfortunately, we don't have an equivalent explanation for physics. Number 6, we should not erase hope that a better explanation for physics may likely arise in the future. A mechanism as powerful as Darwinianism is for biology. However, the design hypothesis still loses. This is conclusion. Just looking at this, can anyone point out some flaws? Just logically. Did you read through?
Well, number 5
Okay.
says we don't have the equivalent yet, so it's a post-dated check.
Yes. That's very true. And he just seems to shift from Darwinian evolution to physics without any kind of premise.
Doesn't Darwinian evolution somewhat imply a design? Because if it has to work a certain way, then
Mhm.
there has to be a reason why that is.
Exactly, yeah. But he just kind of throws it out there saying, hey, it's not design, it's just natural. That's good.
Then
Yeah.
Number 3, who designed the designer problem,
Mhm.
it sidesteps what the whole
Mhm.
group is about, is whether or not there's a designer.
Exactly, it's going off trail,
Beyond that.
right. Anything else? Yeah.
There's an issue with number 3 too, since he says that wanting to argue for design is a false one merely because there is another problem that might or might not have an answer, therefore the whole thing is off.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Doesn't make much sense, does it, if anyone looks at this? Anyone here taken modal logic or any type of logic class?
Sound good?
Yeah, and then so you realize like the premises have to follow one another to reach a logical conclusion. And here he just seems to kind of be shooting off arrows at every direction. And it just seems that he wants to conclude the design hypothesis still loses. So this is a problem. And so I've listed some objections in here. Who designed the designer? In order to recognize an explanation as the best, one needn't have an explanation of the explanation. It becomes too regressive. Anyone in here have children, worked with children? Then you know what happens when you explain something. They go, why?
Yeah.
Then you explain it. Well, why? Why? Keeps going back progressively. And you know what? At the end, you just say, just because. Which sometimes seems to satisfy them, right? So it just seems like he's trying to get at that. Who designed the designer? You're right. That does not belong in this series of premises. And so he just wants to throw out who designed the designer. A little bit illogical. And as I said earlier, premises do not naturally follow one another, jumps in logic. So Dawkins' argument overall fails. So if anyone ever uses that on you, you can just point out those flaws and win your argument.
Can you go back and explain a little bit on premise 2? And I don't know if it's because it's confusing.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
I think it makes sense. But
Yeah.
when he says the appearance of design is not the same as design.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of give an example, I guess,
Sure.
of what he would say is a better example?
Yeah, I understand. And it's kind of awkward writing. I just took this right from his book. And we want to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. So I think what he's trying to get at there is, I think a better explanation would be like a painting or something along those lines. It appears designed, and we all know logically that doesn't happen just in the natural world. Someone had to create it. So we want to point back and say, hey, like that's the designer. I think that's what he's saying. Because we could look in the world and say, this is created, and so we would, if we were to take all that cumulatively, we would naturally follow it back to a designer.
Well, there's some things that seem to be designed which are not designed by particular beings like the man in the moon,
Right.
right? So you seem to see a design, but you could account for it without a human being or some entity that could create, producing an artifact. So he says there's the appearance of design, and we're used to trying to find design as part of our human psychology. But if we're truly scientific, we'll try to account for all these things without an intelligent cause behind any of it. And that's what's behind his whole argument, is he won't allow a non-naturalistic explanation for anything in nature. So that's why he says, at 5, unfortunately, we don't have an equivalent explanation for physics, which should mean, well, let's look for a better one. But what he's saying is, just wait, and eventually we'll have a naturalistic explanation that doesn't require any kind of designer. It's very presumptuous, because you can't explain something with nothing. So well, give us time and we'll come up with something. But that doesn't mean you explain anything. You can't explain something with nothing. So there's this huge assumption, presupposition, that only a naturalistic worldview can explain the universe. So he's excluding, in principle, any kind of design inference. So he set up science in such a way, artificially, that design inferences can never be applied.
Yeah, exactly, thank you.
Yeah, add something to that too. This example just came into my head. And it would be as though what he's doing can be placed into, if you imagine it being in a court of law. And you were trying to determine what the best explanation for a crime was. Is it the person in front of you who did it or not? Well, you're going through, you have to go through all of the evidence. And what ends up happening is the evidence will put forth the best explanation. But what Dawkins is doing basically is saying, okay, well, we want to look for the best explanation, except if it's of a certain type, or except if it's the guy who's standing in front of you who's actually on trial. Then, no, we have to just free that guy and go on looking. So if there's a best explanation that's put forth, the only way it can be accepted is if it's not the design explanation.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you for clarifying. And it kind of, so basically Dawkins sits here and cherry picks what he wants. And if you return back to the quote I had on the first page, Michael Behe, science is not a game in which arbitrary rules are used to decide what explanations are to be permitted. Rather, we want to make true statements about physical reality. And he's outright violating Behe's quote. You know, he's picking and choosing what he wants to be permitted. Naturalistic worldview, and he's going to stick with it, by golly. So, you know, he tries to get away with it, but if you read it through with a thorough logical eye, you see that it falls apart. Any more comments or questions?
Just thinking about how premises 5 and 6 on here and all the corollaries that are following from that we're discussing. I mean, to follow Dawkins's system here actually requires an incredible amount of faith.
Yeah.
Which
Exactly.
more faith and less reason in some ways, in a lot of ways, than
Exactly.
actually what we have here.
Yeah, and he would probably shoot the same back at Christians, you know, and saying, oh, you have all faith and no reason, but, hey, yeah, I agree. Anyone else? Okay, so I think we can just move on to the conclusion. So the argument for design appears to be the strongest and best explanation of deductive, going back to that simplest and best possible reason. The teleological argument, based on the fine-tuning of the universe, bears well as a sound and persuasive argument for a designer of the cosmos. Teleological here just means an end goal, if anyone didn't know. So, end goal obviously being fine-tuning. Bruce Gordon, Canadian philosopher of physics, he says that design inference is the best due to its ability to be placed into the form of a deductive argument, its possession of empirical content, and because it satisfies the requirements of the causal statistical models by isolating factors statistically relevant for the explanation of the event. That's a really long sentence. But basically it's just saying you can put it into a deductive argument, you can have empirical content, so you can just talk about this in a plethora of different ways. And remember, you know, if you want to use this trying to persuade someone, you can approach it in many different ways, which is pretty cool. So What can we learn about God out of all this? So just remember that fine-tuning argument is not explicitly Christian in nature. It only points to a creator. So obviously, I'm skipping down to the very bottom, cumulative case argument in this will probably help the best, which means you're just going to want to gather a whole bunch of different arguments to put them together and then postulate from the Christian God. Something along like ontology, cosmology, etc. So this doesn't really stand alone by itself. You're not going to prove, the existence of the Trinity by this. But there are also, if we want to look a little bit further into this theologically, there are several divine attributes that can be evidenced through fine-tuning if we want to apply it to God. We can say that God is personal, that he interacts with his creation and obviously designs and fine-tunes. We would also say that God is transcendent. We reject pantheism here, that God is in everything. There's obviously something above all of the creation that's transcendent in order to create all of this. God's also powerful. He's omnipotent. Who else can put together these extraordinary statistical numbers that only we have discovered a very small minutia of? If you think about that, like we still know very, very little compared to God, which is just mind-blowing. We could also even say that God is benevolent to his creation. Fine-tuning is enough of a precision to enable beautiful sunsets and nature and mountains. He didn't have to create things that way, but he decided to specifically fine-tune to have beauty in the world, and I think that's a very powerful statement. So finally, Robin Collins, a physicist, says, fine-tuning by itself cannot tell us whether God is personal or not personal. We have to find out in other ways. Fine-tuning, it does help us conclude that he exists, he created the world, and that therefore the universe has a purpose. And I think that's the best way to conclude. That he exists, he created the world, and the universe has a purpose. So, that's the end of my talk. And I just included on the back, I included bibliography, just if you want to read a little bit further. Like I said, I'm no expert in this field, but some of these people are, except Richard Dawkins. Yeah, don't read him, but the rest, and they're very, there's some that are a little more accessible than others. Lee Strobel's The Case for a Creator is probably one of the best places to begin. You're going to get a little more technical with Bruce Gordon, Michael Behe, but they're still really worthy. And I just want to say, I am very encouraged that you can put science and faith together. I think that's wonderful that these men and even women have taken their talents and have used it, and we can say in the scientific world, there may not be many believers, but of the few that there are, they really want to make these points and cases, and I'm just very encouraged that they do that. So, any concluding questions?
I've got a question about the idea of faith that you brought up.
Mm-hmm.
So with people who are atheists, they really aren't walking in a faith about science, that science
Exactly.
will eventually prove
Mhm.
these points.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking to them, how do we, it feels like a really strong worldview to come up against.
Yeah.
How do we even interact with that in a way that it points to God?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I think the first place to start is in a position of humility and an openness and approach, and let them explain first. I found that when I talk with atheists, it's just say, tell me a little more about this. And I think you can use these tools as a gentle way to point to the evidence. 1 Peter 3:15 says always have it available, for your faith, and do it in a gentle, respectful manner. And it's a hard line, and I think the other component is having the Holy Spirit. Just pray that the Holy Spirit will open, because and just keep up that dialogue, never give up. I think we see, those walls can come down. The Holy Spirit can have those walls come down. And so that's what I would say. Yeah. Humility, perseverance.
Can I add something to that? I think this is a really deep topic of how do you talk about this stuff. And one of the things that we have to remember is that most people, when they hear the term evidence, are thinking about naturalistic, scientistic evidence. Scientism is the view that you can only have knowledge through science, which in and of itself is what we call self-refuting. Because It is not known through science. That is a knowledge claim, but it's not through science, it's a philosophy statement. So what we have to do is listen and figure out, am I dealing with someone who really has no idea what evidence to even look for because they don't know what evidence means? Evidence just means any type of reason that should lead you to a certain conclusion, or when compiled together with several lines of evidence, should lead you to a certain conclusion. That may or may not be what they are expecting or what they think. They may think that evidence needs to come straight out of a science lab, but that's not necessarily true. If you're dealing with an abductive argument, which we are now, what we have to do is reason philosophically through some strictly scientific evidence. In this case, it's mostly scientific evidence, but interestingly enough, none of it is stuff that is going to be specifically derived from laboratory experiments. It's partially derived from laboratory experiments, but all of it involves a bigger philosophical postulation too, or a bigger inference that involves a lot of lines of scientific evidence. So we have to figure out how to approach evidence in general and what to do with it and how to be responsible with it and not avoid a conclusion just because we don't like the conclusion.
Yeah, and even to add on to that, maybe another way to approach an atheist or a non-believer is to say, an objective argument maybe is how do you know your spouse loves you? Well, do you have any hard, physical, tangible proof? Well, no. Well, they gave me this ring, which signifies that they love me. They tell me they love me. There's all this evidence, and it cumulatively makes a case. So, we even have objective arguments in everyday life, not even just within like hard, cold, tangible science. So maybe that's another way to kind of talk to them. Yeah.
Well, a lot of people don't even know these arguments are out there.
Mm-hmm.
It's ignorance. They're not taught it in their physics classes, their astronomy classes, and their idea is, well, you have to be a Bible thumper or a scientist. And we want to say, wait a minute, look at the evidence, look at the argument, and think about it. Is there a good design inference that makes more sense than the universe being explicable without any design whatsoever? And you want to say, I don't just presuppose the truth of the Bible and then impose it on the universe. Trying to see what the universe is telling us. And that ends up aligning with what the Bible says, that there's a creator and a designer. But it's playing fair. It's not saying, well, we don't like science, we like the Bible, so this is how we view the world. It's an inference based on a lot of data, using a legitimate argument form, and it considers alternatives. So it's not dogmatic in the sense of saying, it has to be this way, period. It is concluded that design is the best explanation for the data. And really, given the domination of the sciences by naturalism, many people don't get this kind of explanation, or they caricature it. So simply presenting the argument clearly, explaining the form of reasoning, the evidence for it, and then also I think adding some visuals can help, like the DVD, The Case for a Creator.
Yeah, that's
it's
wonderful.
extremely good.
And the Privileged Planet.
Privileged Planet, anything that Illustra Media produces on the design influence is terrific.
When you just said a visual popped into my head. And one of the things I was thinking about is if we can illustrate this entire principle by just thinking about something that is designed that we don't know who did it. So Easter Island heads, those are the ones that popped into my head. So let's plug in the Easter Island heads to this fine-tuning argument. So it's this is premise 1. Premise just means line of evidence 1. X is either designed or the result of chance or the result of natural law, often called necessity, or the combination of chance and natural law. So for that X, plug in Easter Island heads. We're trying to figure out where did these things come from because we have no idea who did it. things were discovered long after the last resident of Easter Island was gone. So, premise 2 then. If we've determined that these heads, these Easter Island heads, are not the result of chance or natural law, because, well, why, I'll ask you, why would you rule that out? Why would an Easter Island head not be the result of chance or natural law?
They're multiple, isn't, like, they're not just one, so it kind
Yeah.
of just like, duplicated on purpose.
Mm-hmm, exactly. That, so the repetition of it is a little bit beyond wind and storms, things like that. Why else? Yeah,
It's not in the explanations of just how things naturally occur in the world for large stones to be set upright. It's
Yeah.
much more likely they should be tipped over.
right? They also look like faces,
Yeah.
too. So there are several lines of reasoning, and those are kind of analogous to the lines of reasoning that we're talking about, that Abby's been taking me through, is all of these specific scientific arguments are attempts to get us to think through what are the qualities of the earth, of the universe, and what does that say? Does it have to have had some kind of designer that's analogous to the Easter Island designers? We don't see it, but we know there was a designer there. So anyway, that was just for what that's worth. There's a little imagery for you.
And those objects are very simple compared to what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're talking about fantastically improbable collections of constants, qualities, proportions, laws. And is specified for the universe being life permitting, rather. So with the Easter Island objects, they're complex to some extent. They're not naturally occurring, because as you said, you don't expect things to be structured that way. And then you can specify faces. So you're not reading in a face like the man on the moon. It's too complex
Right.
to read it in. It's there. And then you say, well, what accounts for it? Wind, rain, erosion, birds flying into it accidentally, no. There's obviously a designer behind this, so how much more, given the vast complexity and specificity for life about the universe as a whole? It's just another example of what's called a design inference. You don't have to come up to those objects and say, I presuppose they were designed, therefore they were designed. That's circular reasoning. You say, look at the configuration, consider the probabilities. What would give an account or an explanation for this kind of thing? And it's some mind. And actually at the end here, Robin Collins says this argument doesn't tell us whether God is personal or not. Well, it depends on what he means by personal. If he means personable, then that's right. We don't know if God has intervened in the world after he designed it. But if you have all these complex factors brought together in a way that can't be explained on the basis of chance or necessity with a combination, then all that's left is a mind. And how can a being with a mind be impersonal? A being with a mind has thoughts. And a being with a mind designed the universe. So I think he's actually wrong there. I think that this argument tells us that there is a mind behind the universe. And if there's a mind behind it, that mind is not just some floating abstraction. It's a being that decided to bring all these things together to make room for life.
Yeah.
And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but life permitting, does that mean just a cell, or does that mean humans, or does that mean, what does that mean?
Good question. I think it mainly means just life permitting as a cell, like as we know it.
Okay, so that doesn't take it further to people or animals or trees? or
Right.
anything like that?
It just means that it's hospitable to living organic beings.
There's a definition of that in this chapter, where he goes into more detail about what that entails.
So to kind of understand that, that means, like, cause I sometimes come up with the argument of, or against the argument, and I'm like, well, if you change those laws, who knows if another type of life will occur.
Mhm.
That's saying that no life, no matter, no stars, no nothing
Exactly.
could exist
Right.
under any conditions.
Mhm.
Okay.
Under any conditions.
The definition's on page 110, that we use it specifically in the
Got it.
second paragraph.
Could you read it to us?
Sure, it says, when scientists say universe is life permitting, they're not talking about just present forms of life. By life, scientists just mean the property of organisms to take in food, extract energy from it, grow, adapt to their environment, and reproduce.
Right, so I guess my understanding is that could even include, yeah, just the most basic forms of life, like cells, so.
It seems like our added complexity adds another layer to it.
Exactly.
Yes,
Yeah.
it does.
It really does.
Yeah, you
Do
need
much
more
more.
complexity and more improbability
Mhm.
for conscious observers.
Yeah.
So if you just have some basic form of life, that's going to be vastly improbable.
Mhm.
But when you get more developed, conscious beings that are aware of the universe, it becomes increasingly as you go up the ladder, so to speak.
Yeah.
I'm still kind of having a little trouble separating the physical necessity from, I guess like the differences in physical necessity from, I guess somewhat of the design argument.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
maybe it's just because I don't really quite fully understand.
Yeah, they're similar, yes, in that they want the precision, for sure. Physical necessity, the best way I can try to explain, and maybe Sarah, Dr. Cortez could help, but it's saying those numbers had to have existed. So it's saying that there was no design involved, but it's just that they're there and they just had to exist that way. So it's really, it can't point back to why they exist, if that makes sense. It's just kind of an inadequate argument. Whereas design is going to go a little more in depth, saying that everything's contingent, complex, and specific. So it's specific, but not exactly to those numbers.
Okay, so it's
Yeah.
saying that everything has to be to that number no matter what. Like
Yeah, no, exactly. No, it's just so. And there's nothing you can really regress back to point to an explanation for it. It just is.
So rather than gravity being a setting, if you think of it as a bunch of dials, rather than these being set to certain dial settings, there are no dial settings. It's just there.
Yeah.
They just are.
No,
And no one can turn the dial to something else because that wouldn't make sense. There is no other setting. It just is that way. The universe just simply is.
So
Mhm.
isn't that kind of basically saying the same thing as the chance argument? You're saying that it's just how it is and
Mhm.
that's it, it just came into being.
Yeah, I think chance isn't so hung up on the specific numbers and the constants and the mathematical equations. It's just saying like something like the Big Bang happened, it just happened, and it happened if it makes sense, like if you imagine the numbers parachuting in, it happened to be a 2 landed and a 5 and a whatever, and they're just put into dials, and that just happened to be how it was configured.
So it could have been
a lot.
otherwise.
Yeah, it could have been. Those numbers could have been otherwise, and it just happened to be chance. Like, yeah.
Yeah, and that's where the multiverse comes out of, is this thought that,
Mhm.
well, maybe if it's just chance that we ended up in a life-supporting universe and a life-supporting planet, then in order for the tiny little probability for that to have worked, in order for that to make any sense, then they don't want to say someone specifically made it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So instead, it had to have just been the luck of the draw because there are millions and billions and trillions of other universes that aren't life-supporting, and we just
Mhm.
kind of came up with one that is.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the, if you watch this DVD, and there's a book too called The Privileged Planet, one of the little imagery pieces that they use, little illustrations, is that there's there has to be this universe generator that's just cranking out random different numbers of gravity settings
Yeah.
and what's another one?
Cosmological concept.
There you go, just various settings. And eventually, randomly, one just comes out that's life-supporting. And then what J. Wesley Richards specifically in this DVD says, he's one of the co-authors of the book that was original to it, he says, but we still have a problem with where did the universe generator come from? So even if there's a multiverse generator, why is that there? So you still, even if you claim that the multiverse idea is completely random and what we call ad hoc, then you still have to explain why there is a generator in the first place that's cranking these things out.
Yeah, go ahead.
Question on that. If we accept Craig's rejection of Dawkins' premise 3, that in order to recognize an explanation as the best, one needn't have an explanation of the explanation, are we being inconsistent by demanding an explanation for the multiverse generator?
No, I think that you can. I don't personally, I don't have a problem with too regressive. I go as far back as I need to go. So I'm personally, I don't like that line of reasoning that he uses. But I think even if you did, no, I don't think it's inconsistent because someone's still trying, you're still dialoguing with someone who is trying to find explanations. And if you're trying to find explanations for the universe, then the universe generator all of a sudden looks an awful lot like a god of some sort. And so all of a sudden, if it's not God, then you do have to ask where it came from. If it is God, then it does seem to be kind of ridiculous to keep asking where it came from, but that is totally illogical to say who designed the designer, by the way, because the designer, the being that we're trying to get back to as the explanation, the ultimate explanation, is not a being who could have been designed. It's a being who just is, who is the originator of all that has been created.
Like something that I run into is that the idea of the universe generator, that's an eternal universe kind of thing. So when you get back that far, it's not that it's personal, it's not that it's a God, but it's an eternal natural thing. So how do you answer that?
Then that's where I think it does actually raise the question of where did it come from? Because if it's natural, then, and this is what Craig gets into elsewhere, if it's natural, it makes no sense to say it's eternal. Because if it's a natural thing, meaning a physiological thing, then how in the world can such a thing be infinite? Well, Craig says, and I think he's right here, that that's impossible. That's logically incoherent because it had to have started at some point because that's how matter, that's how physical stuff works. So he doesn't get into that as much in this book because it's really technical.
Yeah. Save it for a rainy day. Any more questions? Did you have one?
Yeah, I don't know, I think what you asked about, how many regressions are permitted, basically, I think that's a very good question. And it's, Dr. Rodez, if you can, I believe there was a philosophical device called, what was it, the homunculus fallacy? Does that sound familiar? Can you, I feel like that speaks to this. Can you explain that in a simple way, or?
Well, the idea of a homunculus is that there's a person inside of the person that explains consciousness and the qualities of an agent. So the idea is that you don't want to appeal to something extraneous. Is that what you're thinking?
I similarly, it's been a little while since I looked this up.
I'm not sure how you would apply that to this.
But rather, as I understood it, the homunculus argument or fallacy was the question a long time ago of, well, why do we have consciousness? Well, because there must be, maybe we'll say there's a little man inside our heads who's just operating this human suit.
Puppet.
And then you have to ask, well, who's running that? Well, a little guy in that one's head. Well, and because it leads to an infinite loop, it's not valid. Whereas just asking, 2 steps back of, okay, well, who created the universe generator? That one isn't necessarily infinite. Does that make sense?
Well, another thing is that if you think that the designer is a self-existent, all-powerful, all-knowing being, then that kind of a being doesn't require anything outside of itself to be explained. If you're looking at the universe, it's contingent, it's complex, it's specified, right? Well, and it's material, it's a collection of finite things. God is not a material being, a collection of finite things. God's not sort of fine-tuned and could have been otherwise. So you're making the mistake of saying that because the universe has to be designed, God has to be designed. Now, you're talking about two different things with different properties. You're talking about an infinite personal being, it's always existed, not dependent on anything else. The universe, you're talking about contingent state of affairs, dependent, could have been otherwise. So that's the place to stop the explanations with a self-existent, immaterial, infinite personal God. So that stops the regress. Now, if you're saying that, well, the explanation for the finite universe is another finite being, well, then that being has to be explained. But you can stop the regress simply by specifying the being that does the explaining. I wrote a little paper on this called Who Designed the Designer? A Response to Richard Dawkins that was in the journal called Think about 7 or 8 years ago. I might be able to produce that for you. Maybe online, but you may have to pay for it. So I'm not sure. Not me, but the journal might require it. So you can stop the infinite regress argument.
Yeah. Yeah, just to clarify, that's what I was saying, that ours does stop the infinite regress.
Yeah, you don't just have homunculus, homunculus, homunculus.
Right.
Great, anything else? All right, well, thank you for letting me teach, and kudos to you all for taking this class, and I hope it's helpful in your Christian journey.
Thank you.
Next week, Dr. Grotheis is going to be teaching, and the next chapter, what is the next chapter? The moral argument?
Moral argument.
Okay, so bring questions too all of these weeks. Just as you're reading through, bring things that you want to talk about, because it will, I think, help the class be able to be individually tailored to each of you. So, thank you, Abby. Yeah.